In this video, we are going to discuss reductionism and systems biology. These are two really broad methods that we use to study living systems. We'll also define biology and talk a little bit about biological organization. So biology is the study of life. You probably already know that from other science courses. You've probably taken biology before, and if you haven't, that's okay. But when we study biology, we are studying living things. So biologists are asking questions about the living world. We're asking things like, why do birds migrate? How do cells communicate within a living organism? What do hormones do? How does DNA code for life? So we're asking about the interactions of all of the organisms in a community, or we're asking about the interactions of the systems within a single body. We're attempting to understand the living world. Now, if we're going to study the living world, we really need to define what life is. So the most basic definition of life is that a living organism is made up of one or more cells. Now, this can be anything from bacteria, which is not pictured here, but we discussed E. coli a little bit in our model organisms video, to fungus, plants, and animals. Because all of these organisms are made up of at least one cell. We'll talk about this definition of life. It's called the cell theory. We'll talk about that in chapter 4. But before we get there, we're going to just focus on what makes something living. And the most basic definition is that it is made up of a single cell. Now, this sort of leads into the idea of reductionism. So reductionism comes from the word reduce, or to reduce something. When you reduce something, you look at its most basic parts. What are the things that it is made of? And so reductionism in biology is understanding the simplest parts, because understanding the simplest parts and how they interact is critical to understanding the system as a whole. You can sort of think of this as a bottoms-up approach. You might want to start with understanding the cells before you start understanding how the cells interact, how they form organs, how they form systems, etc. When we start with the reductionist approach to biology, we're looking at the biochemical processes, the chemical reactions in a cell that allow it to function. And we're looking at the molecular processes. How does our coding molecule, DNA, actually direct all of the processes that are required for a living organism? Now, this is going to lead us to our first level of biological organization. So life ranges from microscopic, from bacteria and archaea, that's our other group of single-celled organisms. We can't see them. So life is anything from things we can't see to whole organisms that we absolutely can see, like your family members, your pet, the birds outside, all of those things. So biological organization starts with the smallest, and this slide is a picture from our book, but it's actually kind of backwards from what we are talking about here. But the smallest unit of life being our cells. So when we're looking at a reductionist approach, we're going to start with the smallest part. And smaller than cells are not living organisms, but there are important parts, molecules, and then organelles. So molecules are the elements, the compounds, the chemical reactions that are going to interact to produce bigger processes. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with chemistry. And then we can go up in levels of biological organization to organelles. Those are the parts of the cell. From there, we get to cells. again, the smallest unit of life. And we can continue with this biological organization. Most of our class is going to focus on sort of these lower levels, and then we'll get a little bit into organisms and populations once we get into evolution. Our class really doesn't deal with levels 1, 2, and 3 there, ecosystems, communities, and we really don't deal with things like organs and tissues, physiology. Those sort of things are going to be in Biology 102. But we are going to focus on cells, cellular function, and how cells work in an organism to make them functional. So when we discuss biological organization, we have to talk about something called emergent properties. Now, emergent properties is not necessarily a biological term, although it definitely applies, and we see it in our biological organization. So emergent properties means that new properties arise at each level of organization. So if we're using this reductionist approach, we're going to want to understand the parts that are organized to make each level above it. So we're going to look at molecules to understand how cells work. We're going to look at cells to understand how tissues work. So a non-biological example of this is a bicycle. So if you think about a bicycle, it's made up of a whole bunch of different parts. You've got your wheels, even the wheels are made up of parts. You've got your wheels, your spokes, you've got your pedals, your bike chain, your seat, your handlebars, the frame. And if you had those in a pile on your garage floor, they wouldn't be doing anything. They wouldn't be functional as a bicycle. But when we organize them in a particular way, we get a new level of organization and we get new properties. Once you arrange them in the proper way, you get new function. You get a working bicycle. So that's one way that we can illustrate emergent properties. If we want a biological example, we can look at the process of photosynthesis. So coming back to this biological organization chart, this molecule here is chlorophyll. Now chlorophyll is just one part that is going to function in this whole process of photosynthesis. Now chlorophyll molecules come together in something called a chloroplast. So when you get the correct arrangement of chlorophyll molecules, and the correct arrangement of membranes and things like that, you get this tiny little organ inside a cell that can actually perform photosynthesis. So here we've got that organelle in that cell. Now photosynthesis is the process of taking sunlight energy and converting it into chemical energy that plants can use. So if you just have a pile of chlorophyll molecules, or you wouldn't have a pile, you might have a solution of it sitting in a beaker on your desk, it's not going to do too much. But when you have them in the right configuration, they'll actually absorb energy. And when you get them in the proper organization in a cell, you get these chemical reactions that are powering all life on Earth. Because all energy ultimately has to come from the sun, and we need plants to harness that energy and convert it for us. So without all of the parts, you don't get photosynthesis. So as we start organizing our molecules into functional things in a cell, we get new functions. Another important part of biological organization is the idea of structure and function. So this happens at every level of biology. And the general idea here is that everything, all of the parts that make up a whole, have a very specific structure. And that structure is intricately related to the function. So, for example, we just talked about all of those chlorophyll molecules that are organized into the leaf. If you look at the molecular structure of the chloroplast, which you don't have to know right now, it's actually this series of folds. Now, those folds are important because they increase the surface area on which the chemical reactions of photosynthesis can occur. So we have a very specific pleated structure that is related to the function of producing the most chemical energy possible. Now, I'd imagine most of you are not experts in photosynthesis at this point, and that's okay. So let's give another example. Another example would be a hummingbird. So hummingbirds have the unique ability to hover. Now, this allows them to drink nectar without landing on their flowers. The reason that they can do this is that the structure of their the bones in their shoulder are such that they allow the wings to rotate in sort of a figure 8, and that allows them to hover. If that structure wasn't there, they would just fly like a normal bird that cannot hover. So that structure is really important in this unique function of the hummingbird. So let's get back to the approaches that we can take for studying biology. So we talked about this reductionist view where you want to understand all the little parts that help an organism or a living thing to function. But sometimes that doesn't really work because sometimes you need to know how the parts interact in order to get a better understanding of how things work and how some things can only function in a certain system. And at this point, we need to look at systems biology. So systems biology in its strictest sense actually combines computational analysis and all kinds of data and things. But what I mean by systems biology is the study of the whole organism, which is a really loose definition. You study all of the interrelated parts. How do they all go together? How do they all interact? And how do they work? Because sometimes reductionism doesn't work. Sometimes you can't study the parts without understanding the whole. So you can kind of think about this as treating the symptoms versus actually effectively treating a whole illness. So you catch a cold and you might take some cold medicine and you're going to alleviate your symptoms for a while. But if you're not taking care of your body, you might continually catch colds. And so you need to do things like boost your immune system, exercise, eat healthy, things like that, because in treating just the cold, you're not necessarily treating the bigger problem, which might be why you continually get colds or something like that. That's just a really basic example. So you can think of reductionism as taking the pieces apart and understanding the different parts. And I'm sure you can appreciate that that's really important. If you're going to build something, you need to know how all the parts work, how they're shaped, what their role is in the larger project. But you can't build it unless you understand what the whole project's purpose is and how all those pieces are going to fit together. So really, to get a good understanding of biology, you have to look at both parts. You have to look at the little pieces and you have to look at the big picture. One thing I like to tell students is that's how you study biology as well. A lot of students will get so bogged down in studying the little tiny details that they don't understand the overall process. Or they just understand the overall process, but they don't understand the important parts of it. So you really have to focus on learning both. You have to learn the little details, the little parts, and you have to understand the big picture as well. So in conclusion for this video, I wanted to throw in this slide that discusses major themes in biology. So if you read all of chapter 1, they'll go through all of these major themes in biology. We're not going to specifically talk about them here, but in case you are sort of interested, they're there. We've already talked about emergent properties. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about genetic information, DNA, We're going to talk about how and why the genetic code is universal. We're going to talk about how that code in our DNA actually leads to living organisms and how it works. We're going to talk about transfer and transformation of energy, because all things that are living must obtain and utilize energy. One of the major themes is interaction with environment. We won't really talk about that too much in this class, but if you think about all living things, they do somehow interact with their environment. Even if it is just a plant growing in the forest, it's taking in all the air around it, and it's being influenced by the soil, things like that. Lastly, we are going to start on evolution and talk about how organisms change over time. And that is continued in Biology 102 if you continue on in the series.